Um, Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to the National Museum of Racing and Hall of Fame's virtual online program series. And today we've got a fun subject to talk about. We are coming up on the 100th anniversary of Man o' War meeting Sir Barton at Kenilworth Park for the 1920 Kenilworth Gold Cup. It's an exciting anniversary that's coming up. Certainly fits well with our mission here at the Hall of Fame. Both of these horses are members of the Hall of Fame, class of 1957. And joining us today, we have two people who could not be more appropriate to talk about this upcoming anniversary. I'd like to welcome Dorothy Hours. She's the author of Man o' War, A Legend Like Lightning. And we also have Jennifer Kelly with us, who is the author of Sir Barton and the Making of the Triple Crown. Ladies, thank you for being here with us today.
Oh, absolutely.
So much.
Yeah, thank you.
We wanted to have a party for this, so here
Yes,
we are.
Yeah, so
plotting all the way.
You guys are such devout followers of racing history, and your books are wonderful tributes to these two horses and tell their complete stories. Before we get into the Kenilworth Gold Cup, which is coming up on the anniversary, I want to ask each of you, and I'll start with Dorothy, just give a little synopsis of the book you wrote relating to today's subject. Man o' War, I mean, it's a name that everybody had heard, and I, from going through it, I think one of your goals, and tell me if I'm wrong, was to kind of separate fact from fiction and myth, and to kind of get to really, there had been so much stuff about him. He'd turned into kind of like a Paul Bunyan type character.
Very much.
And I think I'd just like to hear a little bit about your motivations for writing the book, and what inspired you to do that.
Well, in one way, Secretariat inspired me, because I was living through that time period as a fan. And when people started saying, this is maybe the best horse since Man o' War, it just stokes you that much more to go, well, yeah, I've heard of Man o' War, of course, but let's really get in there. I started going to microfilm. This is back in the 1980s, and looking at what the New York Times said about Man o' War. So the long story short is I started finding things that I was the kid who would read every book I could find on horses. And these were things I'd never seen. And when they started to pile up, and you go, well, this has to be together in one place. It isn't fair to fans to just have it scattered in microfilm. How many people are going to go, do this in this obsessed way? So that's why the book, it took obviously a long, long time. It came out in 2006. And I went off and did other things in life before circling back around to it. But when I circled back around, it's like, wow, yeah, there's a lot here to sink your teeth into. And I really wanted to know the horse. There was no question that he was phenomenal. He was absolutely an all-time great, and quite possibly the greatest, if you're able to even, award that title through so many eras of history. But so he's absolutely deserving of the place he holds. It was really wanting to feel like, well, what would it be like to walk into the barn and there he is, and there are the people who work with him every day.
Jennifer, your subject matter is certainly probably not as familiar to a lot of people before the book came out. I think a lot of people had probably heard the name, but they didn't really know the true story behind the horse and his legacy and everything that he accomplished. What got you on the Sir Barton trail, and just talk a little bit about his legacy and what he's meant to you.
Well, the interesting thing about Sir Barton was it kind of came about accidentally. My husband and I had been talking about what we would be doing if we weren't doing what we were doing at that particular moment. And I happened to be teaching, and I had been a writer since I was a young person. I'd written a novel when I was 12. I've always been a writer. And we talked about all these different things we'd like to do. And mine was, well, I really would like to write a book about horse racing. And he said, do you have any particular story that intrigues you? And I said, well, I don't really know that there's a book out there about the first Triple Crown winner, which this was 2013. And 2019 was going to be the 100th anniversary. And I really felt like, I had not seen a book about him. And I have a lot of horse racing books and have read a lot of material about horses and horse racing over the years. And so I started doing a deep dive and discovered that no one indeed had written a book about Sir Barton. There was plenty of books about Man o' War and about Secretariat and lots of other horses. But when I started doing all the Triple Crown winners, I kept finding that there were gaps in areas. And his, since the 100th anniversary was coming, I thought, why not go ahead and attack this and see if this is something that's doable. And within like a year I had a draft, and then within 2 years I had a contract, and it just his story intrigued me because I felt like every time I'd read a chapter about him in a book on the Triple Crown, there was always these details that were left out. Like you can read a chapter from any of the books on the Triple Crown and they'll give you an overview of the horse's career, but they don't give you those inside details that say, well, how did we go from point A to point B to point C? And especially given his Triple Crown, like at the time that wasn't a thing. How did we get here to the assumption that this is something that should have happened? So the more I dived into his career, the more I discovered here's a horse who at the time was very well regarded, important, famous even, and had just kind of fallen by the wayside, by a confluence of events, not limited to Man o' War. Like Man o' War came in and he pretty much dominated everything, and rightly so. But before him, there was Sir Barton, and literally like in the months leading up to right before Man o' War's debut, they've been calling Sir Barton the horse of the decade and the horse of the century, and they were just really lavishing praise on him because of what he had accomplished. And so for me, it was about being an advocate for the horse and bringing him back into the conversation, because there are so many things about our time period now that are influenced by their time period. And if you don't have that information out there for people to consume, like Dorothy said, Man o' War become this kind of like you said, a Paul Bunyan-esque character where we really didn't know. I mean, you knew what the horse had done, but you didn't know the horse. I felt the same way about mine. He was just kind of this like afterthought, and I really wanted to find the horse. Like, who was this horse that came in and created the Triple Crown? And obviously, he wasn't the only one. Like, other things had to happen after that to make the Triple Crown what it is now. But somebody had to do it first. So I felt the need to tell that story.
So the race that we're focusing on here, the Kenilworth Gold Cup, took place on October 12th, 1920 in Kenilworth Park in Canada. It was hyped as the race of the century. You hear a lot of these race of the century, fight of the century type things, but this was one of those that really got to that hype and sort of was something that just really took hold of the public consciousness. I'd like to hear from both of you the perspective on your particular horse that you wrote about, what that hype was like on their side and what these horses were like coming into this race. Dorothy, do you want to start on that on your side?
Sure. Well, he had already had headlines like in the New York Times, Riddles, Speed, Miracle, the Flying Pegasus. I mean, it would seem like hyperbole, except he had just set another American record without apparently being in any distress at all, not breathing hard, as they say. So by the time August of 1920 arrived and both horses are at Saratoga, the Riddle camp is focused on the Travers. It was the richest, most prestigious target even then. They saw no need yet to jump in against older horses. Mr. Riddle spoke about, there will be time later to do that. But he was set on these very rich targets for 3-year-olds only, beyond the Travers as well. So they had a feeling, I think you would call it overconfidence if it weren't Man o' War. They had a feeling that their horse was almost invincible, which he actually had been in competition, only the infamous Sanford. And that's where they were at when the talk of the match race began to bubble up, was that, who's going to beat this horse? And the trainers started trash talking on the backstretch, Man o' War's trainer, Sir Barton's trainer. Sir Barton's trainer apparently enjoyed needling Man o' War's trainer about how his horse could beat him. And One morning, Fustel finally broke and said, "I'll bet you $100 or $500. My horse right here, right now. Let's go. I mean, my horse can beat him right now. And I think Mr. Riddle will back me for 5,000 if you want." And Bedwell sort of walked away. But at the same day that Matt Wynne from Churchill Downs, who made the Derby into the most famous race in the world, that very same day, he was putting out the feelers to Mr. Riddle and Commander Ross, $25,000, Kentucky. How about it, you guys? So this was mid-August of 1920, and it was already fomenting.
Yes.
Now, Jennifer, at that time, obviously all of the headlines, or many of the headlines, were going toward Man of War, but Sir Barton had won the Triple Crown the year before, even though it was not yet termed the Triple Crown. And at Saratoga that summer, he set a record that Man of War eventually equaled in the Travers. So this was a horse that was in really good form at Saratoga. They had to have been pretty confident at that time. Would you have said that?
I think so. He had a really kind of mixed spring where he had come into April and May, and been kind of out of shape. Like, they had a really hard time keeping him racing shape. He was just not a workhorse. They had to always have relays of horses with him so that he would work. And then, they'd given him some time off. He wrenched an ankle in a race in early May, and they said, well, we'll just give him a break. And I honestly think they just ran him in so many races so close together just to get him in shape, because they really had no other way to get him in shape. He just wouldn't hold form between races. And so, he got to the Saratoga handicap, and that time off from early May to early August really did him some good, because he got to the 1.25 mile Saratoga handicap and just nailed it. 2:01 and 4/5, which now, if you look at derbies, often our derbies are run just the slightest bit slower than that, because the average derby time is around 2:02, somewhere in there. So in 1920, to be running 2:01 and 4/5 is just maddeningly extraordinary. I mean, oh my gosh, like, no one runs that fast in this era. And so he done, like, just sparkled, and everyone just latched onto that. Like, maybe this is the horse that could make Man o' War sweat. Let's do that. And then he, went to Canada for a handicap at Fort Erie, and won easily. He didn't really have much competition. And then he brought him back. And it was after that handicap that Bedwell was needling Fusel, going like, hey, we should run our horses against each other. And Fusel, who was just as level-headed as they come, just didn't take the bait until that one day where he was like, all right, let's do it. But, H.G. Bedwell he's not a fool. He was like, well, we could do that, but my boss might not like that very much. And then, of course, a couple weeks after that, he runs in the Merchants and Citizens handicap and sets a world record, and happens to do it in a faster time than Man o' War ran the Miller, because Man o' War ran the Miller in 1:56 and 3/5, and Sir Barton ran the Merchants and Citizens in 1:55 and 3/5. And so that's kind of like where people started getting really excited about a match race, because it's like, here's Man o' War doing all these things and seriously running out of competition in his own division. And here's Sir Barton over here doing all these things under high weights, and just kind of carrying the torch for older horses, because Exterminator, is still running in this era. Exterminator didn't like go away, but he wasn't sparkling in the same way. And so you've got this intrigue, like, ooh, here's Man o' War, and he's doing this, and here's Sir Barton over here, and he's doing this, and maybe this is the right matchup.
I think one thing I'd like to touch upon is, how did a race like this, which was aptly described as race of the century, magnificent showdown, American racing has Saratoga, they have Churchill Downs, Pimlico was a huge venue at this time, Belmont Park. How did a race this big wind up in Kenilworth Park in Canada? I think that's such a fascinating little detour here, but I'd love to hear how this developed, if you guys want to dive in on that.
Well, I'll say a little bit about New York and Maryland. Maryland tried. Yeah. Laurel Park tried to get it, and they apparently were in the running, seriously, or at least as leverage on Commander Ross's part. It's hard to know how much he really wanted to run in Maryland. Pardon me again. And how much he was just saying, well, Laurel's serious. Maybe I can see what someone else can do.
Yeah.
New York, what was wrong with New York? New Yorkers were complaining. Pardon me. They were saying, the outrage is getting to me. New York was saying, if this race belongs anywhere, it belongs in New York. And they were, the reporters, the fans, but August Belmont and the ones in charge just didn't do it. I guess at that stage, the finances of it, even though people were saying you could get 50,000 people at Belmont Park and charge whatever you want and you're going to more than make your money, they didn't go for it. So they really sort of ceded the field to anyone else and let Matt Wynn, who is very active, and Abe Orpin, which Jennifer will talk about, in Canada, and Maryland duke it out.
I think what happened with New York, they had taken a stab at it, trying to get both horses into the Jockey Club Gold Cup, or Jockey Club Stakes at that point. And neither of them took of course, Man of War took the bait, but Sir Barton, he was like, he's been on the cars a lot and he's kind of gross and just that. And I don't know why they didn't come back and suggest, like, here, we'll do this later, but it might have been still the finances, the tenuousness after coming back from Hart Agnew and being paused for so many years, where they weren't really racing and they were still having a hard time coming back, getting up to financial shape the same way they were prior to that. So what had happened was, it's so random. I mean, honestly, when I found this little nugget, I just thought, I can't believe this is the case. So Kenilworth Park is in Windsor, Ontario. And if you know anything about the geography of Canada and the United States, Windsor, Ontario is actually south of Detroit and across like the St. Lawrence River, I think. And so it's just such a bizarre thing. A.M. Orpin had been a longtime promoter and gambler and had other businesses other than Kenilworth Park, and had this idea he wanted to start a racetrack for the common man. And, it was a racetrack that was very plain, didn't have a lot of accoutrements, didn't have a clubhouse. It wasn't geared toward, the higher set. It was more for just egalitarian. And he knew Commander Ross and he knew H.G. Bedwell, because in the early 1910s, like 1913 or so, Orpin had taken a stab at owning horses and racing them himself. And his trainer happened to be H.G. Bedwell. Ta-da! So that didn't last very long, but I'm sure they struck up quite a relationship, because H.G. Bedwell is a man who knows apparently everybody. So in the late 1910s, when he starts Kenilworth Park, because you can go back and look through the Daily Racing Forum archive and find this, you can find that Commander Ross was entering horses at Kenilworth Park as it opened in like the 1916, 1917, somewhere in there. So they all know each other. Small world, hey. And of course, Matt Wynn is Matt Wynn, and everyone knows Matt Wynn. And I think he was negotiating on behalf of Laurel too. Am I correct? Wasn't he like representing Laurel?
I'm not sure. Spalding was the president of Laurel.
Okay. I thought that I saw there was like this overlap between Wynn's duties in Kentucky, and then maybe he was working for Laurel at some point. That's neither here nor there. I couldn't remember that for sure, but it was like Matt Wynn everyone knew who he was, and so he assumed he had everyone's ear. Whereas I don't know that they realized that Orpin and Bedwell and Ross went back so far. And so when it came about, like rumors about Wynn and trying to get the match race to come to Kentucky, and Orpin's like, oh no, I'm going to come in. And that familiarity, I think, gave Orpin a leg up in getting everyone's attention. So he offered $50,000 first. And then I think before they even had time to open their mouths and say yes or no to $50,000, he was at Harvard McGraw saying, oh, no, wait, how about $75,000? Mm-hmm. And both, Riddle and Ross are like, all right, can't beat that. And that's kind of where it all started, was like Orpin swooping in, and he knows Matt Wynn's going to challenge. He knows Matt Wynn's going to do one last stab at it. And conveniently, Matt Wynn's offer of $100,000 in the Gold Cup gets lost, misplaced. Something happens before Ross and Riddle had shaken on Orphan. We don't know what happened. I conveniently think that Aisha Bidwell just lost the telegraph, but who knows?
So before we get into the actual description of the race and what happened, if anybody who's listening to this has a question for either of our authors, feel free to drop it into the chat message board, and I'll get it to them as we go forward. But so let's talk about the race itself. We're here. It's race day. It's October 12th, 1920. Sir Barton and Man of War, Clash of the Titans. Obviously, Man of War is favored in the race here. I would just like to hear your analysis of how this unfolded. Man of War won the race by 7+ lengths, and he stamped himself as arguably the all-time greatest. But I'd just kind of like to hear your perspectives on the actual race. There was some talk that Sir Barton may not have been in his best form, and I'd just kind of like to hear you guys break down how you think the race unfolded.
Who wants to start?
Something occurred to me about the $75,000, because these days, yeah, any of us would love to have $75,000,
Yeah.
But in 1920,
Yes.
a year's tuition at Harvard University,
Yes.
let that sit for a moment.
Okay.
$75,000 could have paid a year's tuition at Harvard for 375 students. It was an insane amount of money.
It was the highest purse in racing history to that time, correct?
Yes.
Correct. Yes. So that's why people were so excited about that part of it. But as far as Man of War going in, before he left New York, well, let me back up 2 scooches. He had won the Potomac Handicap in Maryland with 138 pounds on his back, giving away massive amounts of weight. And that had taken a toll on him. Even Man of War, that was a lot to ask. And I think his greatness showed in the fact that he succeeded and even managed to set a track record on a track that wasn't all that fast. But when he got back to New York, you can tell in his training, they really took it gently with him for several days. But then he was good. They started, tightening the screws again. And he did a 1.25 mile workout at Belmont Park just before he went to Canada, that it was hand timed. We don't know precisely the time. They averaged about 2:02 flat, which again, this is close to world record speed for a workout. And then they ship him to Canada. So his people were feeling like, okay, we're, this is going to be a cakewalk practically. I mean, you could, how can I put this? I think the Riddles had a lot of respect for Sir Barton because they had seen him at Saratoga. They had seen how brilliant he was. And at the same time, every time they asked their horse a question, he was answering in these ways that were almost unreal. So I think that's where they just felt like, okay, if nothing, if no one gets to him, as they said before the race, if no one tampers with him, the form he's in right now, he's going to be the same as he's been and more.
Yes.
Do you want to say anything about Sir Barton at that point?
Well, we're on the opposite end of the spectrum, I guess. He ran 3 times in August, and he set a record in the first race in the Saratoga Handicap, and then he set a record again in the Merchant Citizens Handicap. And I bring up to people, like, it's not an excuse, it's just a fact. He just wasn't a sound horse. He was very much a horse that he didn't like to work out. So keeping him conditioned was a challenge. And then he had these very thin shelly hooves that were just, I think that's part of the reason why he had such a terrible reputation for being irascible, was that he was just in pain. And they just didn't have the same sorts of options for treating him that we have now. So if you have a horse with similar, ailments, Now there's so many more ways to keep them comfortable and to keep them, functional. And they just literally were like, we're going to race him until he's unsound. And then when he starts showing the slightest bit of, precariousness, we're going to back off of him. So they got into late August, early September, and they're like, for whatever reason, they didn't run him again for the entire month. So there's about 6 weeks between the Merchant Citizens Handicap and the match race. And in this era, it's very unusual for a horse to take 6 weeks off. I mean, Man o' War ran the Potomac Handicap and then ran in the match race, and there was only a couple of weeks or so between those two, maybe 3 weeks.
September 18th was, well, it was a little more time than we might think, because September 18th was the Potomac.
Okay, so there's that one.
Yeah.
But I mean, for Sir Barton to take 6 weeks off, that's kind of unusual for them to have not had something else planned. So I really do think that he was just not 100%, and they had no reason not to run in the match race. The horse had given them zero reason to assume that he was not going to be fit. They just, for whatever reason, backed off of him and let him just be, I guess, to let him recover in anticipation of the match race happening at some point. And then they were working him out, but rather than like Man o' War, who's working out at Belmont Park and people can see him, they're keeping Sir Barton on the farm in Maryland at Bolingbrook or Yarrow Brae. I think it's Bolingbrook had the train track, and he's not in public view at all. And people, rumors started swirling that Sir Barton wasn't 100% because, he wasn't being seen on the track and da-da-da. And so, they conveniently had emissaries come out and say, oh no, he's sound, he's great. Well, in the process of writing this book, I had written a letter to Bill Nack looking for a particular piece of information. And Bill called me. This is, a couple of years before he passed away. Bill called me. And after I picked myself up off the floor and had a conversation with the man, he said, by the way, I don't have the source you're looking for, but I do have this little tidbit that Holly Hughes told me. And I'm over here in my car going like, is anyone else hearing what I'm hearing? Holly Hughes, who, was a trainer at the time and would have been in racing and would have known all the people. Holly Hughes said that Sir Barton wasn't 100%. He was running sore, but they ran him anyway because they honestly had, and he even, Jim Ross said that in the memoir, they had no reason not to. I mean, but he wasn't 100%. He was not the horse that went to the Derby in 1919 and blew everybody away. And then later did, Belmont blew everybody. Just that horse was still recovering from all the wear and tear that just happened to him over his career. And that's why you have these spurts of races. If you look at his racing career, you'll see these like spurts of races. It's the soundness, and he just wasn't ready. And they ran him anyway because, J.K.L. Ross was like, well, can't not run him. But he was not 100%. And Man o' War was about 150 to 200%. And that's just how it was going to play out. And they were realistic about it. But if you read the press during the time, Commander Ross is confident and you're like, yeah, my horse, he's got all the stuff, and I think we'll give Man o' War a good stiff challenge. And behind the scenes, they're like, they were realistic. They knew what they were getting themselves into.
So Dorothy, Man o' War wins the race easily. He sets, I think, the track record by 6 seconds, if I remember correctly, which sounds kind of nuts when you think about it. I don't know who was running up there, what kind of competition they had, but this was obviously the final race of his career. Where do you rate this performance for him out of his 21 career races?
Well, people who saw it at the time rated it quite high because his time of 2:03 flat at Kenilworth Park, it missed the Canadian record by 1/5 of a second, but he was being eased down in the last 16th. And if you look at the Champions book that Daily Racing Form put out, and they have the past performances of every horse, his summary for the Kenilworth Gold Cup is never extended.
Mm-hmm.
And he's winning by 7 and, pulling down at the end. And I just ran across recently a recap from the day after, someone gathering comments from spectators, and one of them said it was like watching a fox terrier chasing a greyhound. So it made me feel really bad for Sir Barton because, he was such a grand horse. But that was the amount of ease that people saw.
Yeah.
And his time, spectators who were familiar with racing in New York thought that the Kenilworth track was probably, and of course, this kind of mind game, we can't prove it scientifically, but in their minds, they thought the Kenilworth track was about 2 seconds slower than Saratoga. So in their minds, Man of War had run 2 minutes flat.
Okay.
It was insane. So, that would be like a horse running 157 today.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this did prove to be Man of War's last race. I don't think it was determined at the time that he was going to retire, but from what I have read historically, they thought about racing him as a 4-year-old, but the weights that they were going to assign to him, there was talk that they were going to put, the 140s, maybe even up to 150 pounds on this horse. And that's what got Riddle to decide on the retirement. Is that historically accurate? And, was that what led to them saying ultimately that he's got nothing left to prove? Let's enjoy him as a stallion.
Pretty much. There was an element that didn't get publicized. Well, first of all, you're correct about the weights. Riddle had his trainer ask Walter Vosburg, who was the eminent handicapper in New York, and Vosburg said, well, I wouldn't start him with a pound less than 140 as a 4-year-old. Then, of course, if he wins, up it keeps going.
Yeah.
And Riddle said, that's it, retire him. But there's a little more to it because Man of War had wrapped a tendon in the Potomac Handicap. The going was kind of cuppy, and, he's a big striding horse. He had hit himself. Fortunately, it went down pretty quickly. He was fine. He ran brilliantly in Canada. But in the match race, he lost a shoe. He lost his left hind shoe.
Mm-hmm.
And he also was found back at the barn afterwards to have hit himself up front again. It was, or something. He had either hit himself or strained himself. there was swelling. So this was not acknowledged in the press at all. But about 6 weeks later, a well-connected reporter, I guess you could say, discovered from Dr. McCulley, who was one of the leading vets at the time and had been treating Man of War through his career, that thanks to Dr. McCulley's prescription, his leg is hard and cold now. So there's this element of, yes, the weight was absolutely true. Maybe Sam Riddle would have found people talked about bring him back for a time trial, at least, bring him back to see what he can do at a mile, with no restrictions. But Riddle just never bit. And that's actually something I admire about Sam Riddle, is he really did, for all that I'm sure he was motivated by the best purses and the honors of having a record earner and all these things. He always treated Man of War like a horse, and what's going to be good for him as a horse. What kind of life is he going to have? Yeah. And I think he was at the point, it's like, nope, we've had so much, we're not pushing it.
Now, yeah. Jennifer, Sir Barton did have a couple more races after this. Talk about the aftermath for him and what his life was like post Kenilworth.
Well, he lost the match race, and the match race was really tough on him. Frank Keogh, who ended up riding him, was ordered to basically keep applying the lash, the whip to him, just to kind of keep him in going, like keep the horse motivated. He's gonna be challenged by Man of War, and the 7 lengths is only because Coomer had to slow him down, because if you watch the film, the crowd's starting to run out onto the course, like at the end of the race. He had to slow him down. So 7 lengths really probably should have been more. And I love my horse dearly. I think he's fantastic, and I will advocate for him all day long. But I'm glad it was only 7 lengths, because he just wasn't 100%. And when Man of War left Kenilworth, you see all these newspaper reports about his movement. You know, he got on a train and he's back here and he's doing this. And then there was no mention of where Sir Barton went or when, really. I had to, do a lot of digging to kind of trace his steps. But within like the week, they were back in Maryland, and they're like, all right, well, that's done. I guess we'll keep going. So he continued. He had 3 more races. 2 were the Wait for Age serials at Pimlico. There's another one. He came in second and a couple of thirds after that. They talk about Man of War breaking the hearts of his competition, like John P. Greer and all these other horses like that. Horses are herd animals, and once they're dominated, I think you'll find some horses just kind of never show the same sort of spark once they've been dominated by another horse. So Sir Barton, for, as small as he was and as good as he was, it just kind of, and I think Jim Ross even said in the book, it just kind of took something out of him. He just wasn't the same. He could still run. He was still a good horse, but he just didn't show that spark anymore. And at least he did as well as he did in his last couple of races, and showed up and finished in the money and all that stuff. Because you can think of horses like Arrogate, who just kind of, his last couple of races, Arrogates weren't as sparkling as other races had been. It's like, you really don't want a good horse to go out in that note. But the following year, in 1921, they were preparing him for a 5-year-old season, and a lot of things had transpired in the interim. Ross had a new trainer, Henry McDaniel, who ironically had trained Exterminator to his Derby win. And McDaniel just took one look at the horse, and he's like, this horse is not running. He is not going to race. He was not fit. They could not get him fit. They were freaking out that he was going to injure himself if they continued trying to train him. So they just retired him. I mean, that was it. And it was, this was about the time that all the advertisements for the Race of the Age is showing up in newspapers. And then you've got Man of War over here, and everyone's like, look at the horse, he's so awesome, which he was very awesome. But Sir Barton just kind of fell off a cliff in a way. And it was like, here's the Race of the Age, where you can see Man of War beat Sir Barton over and over and over again. And it just, I felt like after 1921, everyone, they would give him tacit acknowledgement, but because he wasn't racing anymore, and because people's attention had basically shifted, he was just kind of an afterthought, really. Not the way I wanted him to end.
We do have a few questions that have popped in here. One of the questions, first one is, could you describe what each horse's personality was like? And obviously, Jennifer, I think you touched a little bit upon Sir Barton and his attitude, as they say. But I think personality is always a fun trait in the horses, and I'd love to hear kind of a little synopsis, on both Sir Barton and Man of War, personality-wise.
Well, Man of War was very playful. His trainer did note before he retired, so this would have been as a late 3-year-old, that he was getting very studdish. Mm-hmm. And as he put it, he'd rip the shirt off you if you weren't looking. But I've never heard him described as a mean horse. Mm-hmm. Very much as a high-spirited horse, high energy. His groom would play like keep away games with his hat with him, things like that. And apparently Johnny Loftus, his first jockey, would sort of do fake boxing with him. They had a routine where Loftus would visit him in the mornings or afternoons at the barn and sort of do the, and Man of War would. So, yeah, so they knew, they didn't have a tether ball or something like you might have nowadays, but they interacted with him in these playful ways while also keeping the discipline. And actually, when George Conway led Man of War to the post for several of his races, Conway was the foreman of the stable, mm-hmm. Fustel's first assistant, and he later became a trainer and trained champions for the Riddles. Mm-hmm. But there's one account of him leading Man of War to the post, and here they are with the huge crowd all riled up, and Man of War is nosing at Conway's pockets like looking for a treat. He's with his friend. So
yeah, my
Jennifer,
horse is not like,
any other elements of Sir Barton's personality you want to touch on?
oh, I have a dissertation on that one. So I, early on in my research, read Boots and Saddles by Jim Ross, who is Commander Ross's son, who basically called the horse downright evil. And I was like, I take offense to your suggestion that my horse is mean. So Sir Barton was not a horse. Okay, if you're familiar with Alydar, there's an incident when Alydar was in training where John Beach had gone into Alydar's stall and had moved a blanket because Alydar was napping, moved a blanket just a hair, and Alydar like whipped up, and Beach had to dive out of the stall before Alydar got to him because he was startled. And that was, to me, that was like the embodiment of Sir Barton's personality. He was not a people horse. He was a horse. He was like, I'm an athlete and I'm a competitor and I'm going to, I'm going to be that guy. He wasn't really into, pets, goats, cats, whatever you have around the barn. He didn't really care for those. Not that he would like lash out with them when they came by. He just didn't really care much about other people. He liked his groom, but little things arose in my research that really gave me some insight. Like H.G. Bedwell, if he saw Sir Barton's head sticking out of his stall, he would go by and start slapping the horse on his muzzle. So like H.G. Bedwell was like playfully slapping Sir Barton on the muzzle, whenever he's got his head out. And then that led to Sir Barton like grabbing at people when he came by, because he was like waiting for you to come by. Like, aren't you going to come play with me? So he would start grabbing at people. There was one incident where he did not like being stabled. So when he was older horse and out in Wyoming, his owner talked about, Dr. Hilton said, oh my gosh, he's just so, great and laid back and really, chill and just almost like a young horse. Well, because he was stabled 23 hours a day, he didn't want to be stabled. He wanted to be out of the stall. He wanted to be out. So he resented being stabled, I think, and that led to a lot of these discussions about his personality being somewhat irascible. There's also the pain from his hooves. He was just not, I like to think about like horses that are like American Pharaoh or pets. They like the humans around them. They want to interact with them. Affirmed was the same way. Sir Barton was the opposite of that. He was a horse. And he would tolerate people, but he wasn't going to be the horse that you're like hugging on and laying in a stall with, because that's just not, he was an athlete. He was a horse. He wanted to run and beat you. And he was like, and I even said it in the book, like the horses that were next to him at the barrier, usually the ones that were behind him later. He's like, that's where you belong. You belong behind me, not playing with me. So but I think Jim Ross, being a teenager at the time, had a different perspective on Sir Barton, that he was kind of threatening and evil. And it's like, well, of course you're 15, 16 years old and the horses you're accustomed to are pleasure riding horses. You haven't really had to interact with athletes like that. So that's where I think that impression came from.
Dorothy, there's a question on here about the relationship between Louis Fustel and Sam Riddle. How did that relationship kind of fall apart or break off later on is the question.
I don't know what the specific incident was, if there was a specific incident. But as best I can tell, Fustel didn't feel as if Riddle really trusted him 100%, which is ironic because Fustel, by everyone's description, was one of the most honest trainers you could find. But Riddle had lots of people in his ear saying, look out for this, watch out for that. And, there were bad characters who would try to interfere with a champion for gambling reasons. There's a rumor that I've not been able to verify, but maybe there's information somewhere, that at one point Riddle had a private detective look into Fustel. Well, that would have been really offensive if you're a good guy and everyone else knows. So I think really their temperaments didn't match.
Yeah.
Fustel went on, he actually went to work for Major August Belmont after he left Riddle. who had been his original employer in the horse business. And they had a, and then unfortunately Belmont died in late 1924. But I'm not sure that there was one specific incident with Riddle. I think at a certain point, Fustel just thought, I'm getting the feelers that I can go a different direction. Enough is enough.
Yeah. We got a question, and Jennifer, maybe this one's for you. I think we actually had a little discussion about the jockey, Frank Keogh. There's a question here. So Frank Keogh rode him in the match race. What happened with Earl Sandy, who had ridden Sir Barton before? Can you talk a little about that? There's a question here asking about the removal of Earl Sandy from Sir Barton.
Yes, there's a couple of different things that you have to know prior to the match race. So first, in 1918, Earl Sandy was just starting out, and he was a contract rider for Commander Ross. He rode Billy Kelly in a match race against Eternal, which essentially was supposed to decide the 2-year-old championship that year. And he got outwitted in the match race by Andy Schuppinger on Eternal. So he was 19. Okay, so everybody, let's just like establish the fact that he was 19 years old. It was like his first year of real like race riding. So that was, I'm sure, in the back of Commander Ross's mind. Also in the space of that year, when Charles Coomer broke his shoulder. He broke his shoulder, right? In that spill? Okay. He was out during August and was unavailable to ride. So Fustel took on a series of substitute riders in his stead, and one of those was Earl Sandy. Earl Sandy had to ride Man o' War. I think it was in the Miller, and Earl Sandy got off of that horse and said, "I don't ever want to ride him again." He was like a workout, just keeping him in check. So at some point in that interim, Earl Sandy had been asked about riding Man o' War and had basically said that he thought Man o' War was better than Sir Barton.
Yeah, he said, "I never felt anything like that horse in my life."
Right.
He's like a machine.
Yeah. And I'm sure Commander Ross, as fabulous an employer as he was, and as good of a sportsman as he attempted to be, I'm sure Commander Ross was not exactly thrilled about his contract jockey in the press, saying this about Man o' War. Like, say it privately all you like, but saying it to a reporter, that's a different story. So we get to Kenilworth and the run up to the match race, and like everyone can tell that Earl Sandy is in a state of anxiety, like high anxiety. He's very, like twitchy, and he wasn't riding well because they had brought the whole stable, and they had run several horses at Kenilworth in the days leading up. And they were just afraid that Earl Sandy was not going to have the best judgment because, hello, here's how he did in this match race 2 years ago. And then here's, what he said about Man o' War, and oh man, but H.G. Bedwell's just like, I don't think he's the guy. And Commander Ross, very rightly so, had started looking around at like, okay, well, if I need a substitute, let me see if I can get this guy. So at one point he thought about Charles Coomer, which of course is, Man o' War. And then he wanted Johnny Loftus. Well, Johnny Loftus doesn't have his license at this point. And even if he did, he probably would have ridden for Riddle anyway, because he was under contract with Riddle in 1920, or supposed to be. And then he thought about Cal Schilling, which is a whole other affair into itself. Like, that's a whole other hour of discussion by itself. And then he was like, well, we'll just, I think it was Kerry Grayson said, why not just bring in Frank Keogh as the backup, just in case someone gets injured. Well, of course, the day before the match race, Bedwell's and Ross's ear going like, you can't trust this guy. And they spent the entire evening debating it. And then the next day, Ross just makes up his mind. He's like, all right, I can't take any chances. I'm going to have to go with Keogh, who at the time was coming into a resurgence in his career and had, he was a good rider. So at the very last minute, like literally hours before the match race, they announced that they were substituting Keogh for Sandy. And Earl Sandy just like, he's just upset. He's cries. He's angry at being taken off the horse, but Commander Ross, it was an impossible decision. How do you do that? How do you make that decision? Do you trust the rider you've had for 2 years that didn't ride Sir Barton in Triple Crown, by the way, that's my office, but has been riding Sir Barton for years? And then or do you bring on this other guy that you don't know as well, but you know of, and substitute in the most important race of the entire year? That's how we get Frank Keogh substituted at the last minute. And we could debate, all day long whether or not that was the right choice. I have no idea. I don't know if it made that big of a difference, to be quite honest. I just think it was so interesting because I said it in the book, like, the Merchants and Citizens Handicap, which Sir Barton won by nose, the horse that lost to him was ridden by Frank Keogh. Like Frank Keogh couldn't keep Nome straight and lost the race because he couldn't keep Nome on a straight path. Whereas, Earl Sandy, steely nerves, got the win in this like stretch duel. So I'm going, how do you make this choice?
We got time for a couple more questions. There's kind of a neat one here that popped in. And this may be a little rumor, maybe there's some truth to it. Perhaps touch upon Bedwell approaching Riddle and Fustel about a cut of the purse. This is brought up here, and I know this is something that's been discussed a little bit in the past. What is your take on this?
Well, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm like, since he's Sir Barton's trainer, I'll say that I am not surprised. I respect H.G. Bedwell. He has tremendous talent as a horseman, but he was not a fool. And he also had not gotten where he was by necessarily always employing the most upstanding choices. So I'm not surprised. I'm a little disappointed though, because it wasn't like he wasn't getting paid well by Commander Ross, but I think he saw it, just the match race, as a losing proposition. And he was a betting man, and he wanted money somehow. He had a family to take care of and a farm and horses of his own, and he just wanted to get something out of the deal. And he's like, BT Dubs, I got this horse that you're probably going to beat. Why don't you kick back a little bit and I get reward me for bringing the horse here. I don't even know what his justification was for asking. So Dorothy can probably speak to that, to the Man o' War side.
Well, what I found is that the Library of Congress has files from the Pinkerton Detective Agency.
Mm-hmm.
And August Belmont had been very interested in this development. And he was the chairman of the Jockey Club, as well as being the man who bred Man o' War. And he had communicated with the Pinkertons, with Riddle, with Fustel, to establish that, yes, Bedwell wanted a taste. And no, this wasn't good, because the agreement was winner take all. And it could look as if Sir Barton's trainer was saying, well, what will you give me if my horse loses?
Mm-hmm.
Horse racing didn't want even the slightest hint that there was something dishonest about this race. Okay. So even, in fact, Riddle and Fustel not agreeing, nothing wrong actually happened. Sir Barton ran on his merits. He wasn't pulled or anything. But just the idea, I think that's what Bedwell didn't grasp, was that just the idea of making this offer was the opposite of what the Jockey Club would tolerate.
Oh yeah. It was, I was just mystified that he thought he could get away with it. That he thought no one would say something. It just floored me that he just thought he could elide, August Belmont of all people, and not that discussion would not, become known. Like, are you crazy? This is the biggest race of the year, and you think you're just gonna make this offer and no one's gonna say something about it? But there were other things. It wasn't just that. There were other things going on that caused the breakup of the stable in the months following the match race. But that had a whole lot to do with how the Jockey Club decided that they needed to treat H.G. Bedwell going forth. So that and some other things play into why H.G. Bedwell and Commander Ross ended up terminating their relationship in the following year.
Mm.
Dorothy, how much of that, the Pinkertons and their involvement, do you think may have kind of stemmed from, Man o' War as a 2-year-old? There was a great amount of discussion about, his one loss with upset there.
Oh,
There was a lot of discussion with that race being fixed. Obviously, the two jockeys involved in the race, at the end of the year, they were not having their licenses renewed, and neither of them ever rode again. How much of this was a great concern in the sport at the time?
Oh, it was a huge concern. The actual honesty and the perception of, and there again, August Belmont, maybe the pendulum swings far one way and then far the other. In Belmont's era, there was no court of appeals. If the jockey club said, we're not giving you a license, sorry, you don't have a public hearing. You don't have a lawyer advocating for you.
Mhm.
And then the pendulum swung the other way many years later with the famous case, the Jules Fink case, where the jockey club lost all its powers, essentially, in that regard. But sorry, I drifted a little bit. It really, the whole decade leading up to Man o' War and Sir Barton, there had been effort after effort from the jockey club to improve the public perception of racing, because racing had been shut down in most of the United States for a few years, circa 1909, 1910. So Belmont and his peers were building back to show, see, we can have gambling. It's not going to ruin lives. This is wholesome sport. We're improving the breed of horses.
This is also the year of the Black Sox scandal.
1919, right?
And Arnold Rothstein had a hand in all that. So not only is horse racing dealing with the after effect of the temperance movement, and it's, not just talking about alcohol, talking about gambling too, any of the vices. It was also, here's this huge fix that happened in the World Series, which was at the time one of, the most vaunted events in American sport. And if you can fix the World Series, what is to stop people from doing the same in horse racing? And then and the jockey club did everything they could to shut down any sort of, even the sniff of impropriety. They were like, zoom, no to Johnny Loftus, no to Bill Knapp, no to Cal Schilling, no, you are done. And even if they spent 10 years showing that they could behave themselves and they could train, you can be a trainer, Johnny Loftus and Cal Schilling, but even if they spent 10 or 20 years training and showing that they were on the up and up, they still were never allowed to go back to riding ever again. Like the jockey club was just, even the slightest sniff of impropriety, you were done by. That's how bad it was.
I got one more question here for you guys. Both of you did exhaustive research on these books, and they're wonderful additions to the history of this sport. Is there anything on either of the horses that you were not able to uncover, that you had questions about? Is there any sort of mysteries that still linger with either of these horses that maybe kind of grate at you a little bit, that you couldn't find, or anything along those lines?
That's a fantastic question.
I don't know if there's anything left about Man o' War that we don't already know.
Well, at the time of researching the Sanford, which you mentioned, the race he lost, I wished, like anything, for transparency into the jockey club records.
Yeah.
There are no minutes of meetings saying this is specifically what we discussed about Johnny Loftus, and this is why we're making this decision not to give him the license. They did not rule him off the turf, which is a very important distinction.
Right.
They did rule people off the church just like that when they thought they had him dead to rights for cheating. So there are indications that Loftus actually rode an honest, though not so great, race in the Sanford. And there's numbers of reasons for that I won't get into, but one of them is they could have ruled him off. And I think they would have, to make a strong statement. We will not tolerate cheating even from the top jockey in the country. The fact that they just set it aside indicates maybe there are other circumstances. But that would be it. If I could find one Man o' War relic that probably never existed, because the jockey club just would have their committee meeting and they'd agree. And there probably were no detailed notes. but I went to August Belmont's papers and the Pinkerton's papers, hoping to find something about that decision on Loftus. And that would be the Holy Grail.
I think the Holy Grail for me, well, I think there's two. One, and I see it in the chat, the Race of the Age. And you and I talked about this earlier this week. We don't have an extant copy of the Race of the Age as a whole. I think it was supposed to be 2 reels. I've never been able to find an entire copy of the match race, like the whole, because supposedly they were there to film all the preparations, to film the horses working out. I'm sure there were scenes of Commander Ross and Mr. Riddle interacting, just all these sort of gems that Dorothy and I would probably plot if we could find are just gone. We just haven't been able to find any of it. Photographs even. I mean, screenshots, something. Like Dorothy said earlier this week, she's like, I hope it's like hiding in someone's attic somewhere, and then we'll just uncover it and it'll be like, like the light will shine down from, the sky or something. The other one for me, and I know this came up in the chat too, often rumors about what H.G. Bedwell did to prepare his horses would arise, and often those rumors involve something chemical. And, I tried to address this in the book as fairly and as, I don't know, straightforward as possible. We don't know. Like, we don't know. We have rumor, and rumor is often based on either secondhand knowledge, something someone said, I saw or I heard, and then rumor is, communicated that way. So Red Smith said this, and in the 60s, and you hear it, little smatterings of it here and there and beyond. I have no definitive proof. I wish I had some way. I, as a person, want to believe that my horse ran on the up and up, and that every time he went out on that racetrack, what you saw was what he was capable of, for good or for bad. The days that he was off, he was off. He was a racehorse. But the days he was on, he was, as good as it gets. And I wish I had some way to quell the rumors that have, not abounded, but that still exist. I still get asked about it. I have no definitive proof either way. I mean, all I can do is just rely on, what sources have given me. And, the sources that I have don't say that that horse in particular was ever one that H.G. Bedwell would have treated like that. But that's my Holy Grail, is like like travel back in time, Dorothy and I on a train, and we're going to go back to 1920, and we're going to be there. We're going to witness all this stuff, and we're going to know firsthand exactly how it all went down. And that would be my, like, if the TARDIS existed.
I was picturing the Hogwarts Express, except a 1920 private railroad car.
Like, I would ride with the doctor on the TARDIS to go back to, to be there, just to kind of be able to come back and say, this is what happened.
Well, I want to thank both of you guys for being a part of this today. This has been a really fun discussion, a lot of great stuff. I know you both are working on some new projects. Do you guys want to maybe tell a little bit about that, or tease kind of what you're working on?
I want to hear from Dorothy first.
Well, I'm still in my favorite neighborhood of, early 20th century to mid 20th century thoroughbred racing, and the groundwork from the Riddle stable, and Man of War still is informing the sorts of questions I'm asking. I don't have a book under contract at the moment. I've been taking a lot of time with exploring something. It's just like if a horse comes and nudges you on the shoulder and says, hey, look at me, want to meet me? Come on. So I've been on a journey of a few years doing that. And, when it's ready, I'll know. Right now, I've got a huge manuscript that's way, 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 way too big. And I'm just taking time. It's like, that's the thing. If you're not under a deadline, the moment I present it and say, here, I have something to sell, then that locks it in.
Yeah.
And there will be a point to do that. But I'm going to make the most of the time before that point.
Well, enjoy the process. And one thing I did want to mention before we get to Jennifer is Man o' War was Dorothy's first book, and her second book was about a son of Man o' War, Battleship, who's in the Hall of Fame. And if you haven't read this story, it's probably a whole nother conversation here that would take hours, but Battleship's legacy is absolutely incredible. He's also a Hall of Famer with an unbelievable story that I can't even begin to dive into because we'll be here all day, which would be fine, but they're both very highly recommended, and I'm really looking forward to whatever comes next for Dorothy. Jennifer, you're still diving into the Triple Crown series, and you're going from the first Triple Crown winner to the second and the third. Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh my gosh, I am so excited about this book that I every day that I get up and I get to work on it, I am the happiest person on earth because I've had so much fun with this. So I am under contract from the University Press of Kentucky to deliver Foxes of Bel Air, tentatively titled The Quest for Gallant Fox Omaha and the Quest for the Triple Crown. So the idea is that I would discuss in the book the careers of both Gallant Fox and Omaha, and a little bit about Bel Air Stud in this era, with an eye toward discussing how the Triple Crown in the 30s becomes more of a thing. Because once Sir Barton did it sort of lingers as this like idea, but it doesn't really take the shape that we know of until you get into the 30s and you have Gallant Fox and then Omaha and then of course War Admiral later in the decade, and then of course in the 40s it really like just takes off as a thing. But I noticed while I was working on Sir Barton that no one had written a book about Gallant Fox and Omaha, and I'm a horse racing historian, but I am most specifically a Triple Crown historian. So this is my goal, is that I will, work with every Triple Crown winner that doesn't already have a book in some way, shape, or form in the next few decades, if I hopefully live that long. So I hopefully will have Gallant Fox and Omaha to you guys in a couple of years. We're crossing our fingers. 2023, somewhere in there. I finished the first draft portion for Gallant Fox, and I'm just about to start on Omaha. So if you want to hear more about it, I'm on social media. You can hear me yak about it constantly. And then hopefully follow that up with another Triple Crown-esque book. But for now, Gallant Fox and Omaha. I'm so excited.
Well, I want to tell you guys both, enjoy the journey, enjoy the process of putting together your future works, and we're certainly excited to follow along and see what you guys produce next. And we'll certainly have you guys on again. But thank you so much for participating today. It was a fun discussion, and everybody give a little nod on the 12th to think about these two great horses and what they accomplished in their careers. So thank you very much, and we appreciate it. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Brien. We appreciate it
so
Great
much.
having you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.